I cheated and got pregnant with my affair partner, then granted my coward husband his divorce, but refused to raise my affair baby, even after my affair partner abandoned me. I'm not specifying my youngest child's gender here because they're still figuring that out themselves. Out of respect for them, I'm using they/them when referring to them. I cheated, had a child from that, and now my ex refuses to have anything to do with that child. I'm 37, my ex-husband is 36. We were married long enough to have 3 kids who now move between 2 homes like it's normal, even though nothing about how we got here was normal. 6 years ago, I had an affair and got pregnant. I could say I was unhappy. I could say we were distant. I could say I felt invisible in my own house. Some of that would even be true on certain days. But none of it changes what I did or how I did it. It didn't start dramatically. It started in small ways that were easy to ignore at the time. Conversations that lasted a little longer than they should. Laughing at messages I didn't show anyone. Looking forward to seeing someone who wasn't my husband. There was a moment I remember clearly. I was in the kitchen, one of the kids asking me where their shoes were, another one arguing about homework, and my phone buzzing on the counter. I looked at it and smiled without thinking. My husband noticed. He didn't say anything right then, he just looked at me a second too long. That look comes back to me sometimes. Things crossed a line not long after that. I told myself I would stop. I didn't. I told myself I'd tell my husband. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't serious. That was the lie I held on to the hardest. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew immediately there was a chance the baby wasn't my husband's. I remember sitting in the bathroom staring at the test, feeling like everything had already collapsed but nothing had actually happened yet. The house was quiet. My husband was in the living room with the kids. Someone laughed at something on TV. It sounded far away, like it was happening in another house. I didn't confess right away. That's another part that matters. He found out before I told him. I still don't know exactly how much he knew when he confronted me, but it was enough. There was no long conversation, no back and forth. He asked questions. I answered some. I avoided others. He went very still in a way that scared me more than if he had lost his temper. Within days, he was talking to a lawyer. The pregnancy slowed everything down legally, but emotionally, it was over almost immediately. I moved out before the baby was born. Not in some dramatic scene. It was quiet and practical. Boxes, bags, dividing things that used to belong to both of us. The kids watched more than I wanted them to. They kept asking where I was going, when I was coming back, and why I wasn't staying. I didn't have good answers. I said things like, "It's just for now, and we're figuring things out." Even as I said them, I knew they weren't real answers. The other man was still around at that point. He stepped into a role that looked like support on the outside. He helped me move. He stayed over. He talked about the baby like it was something we were building together. For a while, I leaned into that version of things. It felt easier than sitting alone with what I had done. When the baby was born, reality caught up in a way that couldn't be avoided anymore. My ex came to the hospital briefly, not to support me, to see what needed to be done legally. He stood near the foot of the bed, not close. He looked at the baby once, then at me, then started asking about paperwork. I remember feeling angry in that moment, which makes me cringe now. I had this irrational expectation that he would still show some kind of softness. Instead, everything about him was shut down. The test confirmed what everyone already suspected. He wasn't the father. His name came off the birth certificate. The biological father's name went on it. That should have been the clean breakpoint. It wasn't. Because we still had 3 children together, we ended up with shared custody. The kids moved between homes. School weeks, weekends, and holidays were divided into schedules that looked neat on paper and felt anything but in real life. At first, I thought time would smooth things out. I thought the kids would adjust, that they would settle into both homes and stop looking at me like they were waiting for something to make sense again. Instead, the distance grew in ways that were subtle but constant. My oldest stopped telling me about their day unless I asked very specific questions. Even then, answers were short. My middle child started comparing everything between houses. "Dad lets us do this. Dad already bought that. Dad said we don't need it." My youngest of the 3 would still come to me sometimes, but even that shifted. There was hesitation where there hadn't been before. There was one afternoon that stuck with me. I picked them up from school. They got into the car, all 3 of them, and started talking about something that had happened earlier that day. It took me a minute to realize they were talking to each other, not to me. I was just there, driving. At a red light, I asked a question about what they were saying. My oldest answered without looking up, like it was an obligation. That feeling being present but not included became familiar. Their father handled things differently. He was steady in a way I wasn't at the time. He set routines. He followed through on things. He didn't try to force conversations. He didn't try to make them feel something they didn't feel. I tried harder, but not always in the right ways. I pushed for closeness when they weren't ready. I asked questions they didn't want to answer. I tried to recreate moments that used to happen naturally, like movie nights or baking together, and it felt off, forced. And then there was my youngest. At first, the baby was just there, too small to notice anything. The older kids didn't engage much, but I told myself that would change once the baby got older. It didn't. As my youngest grew into a toddler, the gap became obvious. The older kids didn't see them as siblings. Not really. They didn't pick them up, didn't include them in games, didn't ask about them when they were at their dad's house. Once, my middle child referred to my youngest as your kid instead of my sibling. I corrected them immediately. They shrugged like it didn't matter. I remember feeling something twist in my chest at that. Not just anger at the words, but fear that this was going to be permanent. I tried to encourage interaction, small things at first. Can you read them a story? Can you watch them for a minute? Can you help me with this? Sometimes they did it. Most of the time they avoided it. It wasn't open hostility. It was indifference, which is harder to fight. The other man, the biological father, was still around during those early years. Not perfect, but present enough that I told myself things would balance out. My youngest had a father, even if things with my older kids were strained. Then, that started to fall apart too. It didn't happen all at once. It was small shifts at first. Canceled plans, late arrivals, shorter visits, excuses that sounded reasonable until they repeated too often. I remember one specific evening. My youngest was waiting by the window because their dad said he was coming to pick them up. They kept asking me what time it was, kept looking outside every time a car passed. He didn't show up. I sent messages, called, nothing. Eventually I told my youngest he couldn't make it. They asked why. I said something vague about work. They nodded like they accepted it, but they kept glancing at the window for another half hour. That became a pattern. Over time, those missed moments stacked up. The biological father drifted further out until he was barely there at all. By the time he fully disappeared 3 years ago, my youngest already understood more than I wanted them to. That's when I started looking at my ex differently. Not as my ex-husband, not as the person I hurt, but as the only consistent father figure my children had. I watched how he showed up for the older kids. School events, appointments, birthdays, small things that added up. He was dependable in a way that highlighted everything my youngest didn't have. And my youngest noticed. They would ask questions after weekends with their siblings. What did you do at Dad's house? Can I go next time? Why don't I go? At first, I answered gently. I said things like, that's their dad's time, or maybe another day. But the questions kept coming, and they got harder. One night my youngest asked, why doesn't he like me? That question sat between us in a way I couldn't move around. I told them it wasn't about liking or not liking. I said he wasn't their dad. I tried to keep it simple. They didn't look convinced. That's around the time I first reached out to my ex about including my youngest in some small way. I wasn't asking him to take on a full role. I knew that wouldn't go anywhere. I asked if, maybe, occasionally, he could include them when doing something with the other kids. A park trip, a birthday outing, even just acknowledging them on holidays. He said no, just like that. I thought maybe he needed time. I asked again later, phrasing it differently. Same answer. I started noticing how separate everything was becoming. Two completely different experiences under the same roof during my weekends. My older kids have their routines tied to their father, my youngest orbiting around them without ever really being part of it. I tried to bridge that gap myself, but there's only so much I can do when one child is constantly reminded that the others have something they don't. It wasn't one big moment. It was a series of smaller ones that kept landing in the same place. My youngest started copying things they saw the older kids do when they talked about their dad. If one of them mentioned something like, Dad said we can go next weekend, my youngest would repeat it later, like they were trying the word out for size. Dad said we can watch a movie. There was always a pause after that. The older kids would either correct them or go quiet. Either way, the air shifted. The first time it happened, my oldest corrected it immediately. He's not your dad. My youngest just stared at them, then looked at me like I was supposed to fix it. I said something soft, something about different families and different parents, but it felt like trying to patch a crack with tape. After that, my youngest stopped saying it out loud as much, but I could tell the thought was still there. It came out in other ways. Drawings of our family where my ex was included, standing slightly apart but still there. Questions about what he liked, what he did for work, and what kind of food he liked. Questions my older kids answered without thinking, and then realized too late who was listening. I started reaching out to my ex more often around that time. At first, I kept it measured. I asked if he would consider something small, a birthday card, a message, anything that would make my youngest feel acknowledged. He said no, again, in the same tone he always used, direct, final. I told him it would mean a lot, that it would help, that my youngest was starting to notice the difference more. He said it wasn't his responsibility. That phrase started showing up in almost every response. I understand it logically. I do. But hearing it over and over while watching a child try to understand why they're left out does something to you. I pushed more after that. Not constantly, but enough that it became a pattern. Every couple of weeks, I'd try again from a slightly different angle. Sometimes I focused on the kids as a group, saying it would help their relationship as siblings. Sometimes I focused on my youngest directly. Sometimes I tried to appeal to what I knew about him from when we were married, that he cared about doing the right thing. It never worked. He stayed exactly where he was from the start. Around the same time, things between me and the older kids were getting worse in quieter ways. They weren't explosive or dramatic. It was more like a steady withdrawal. They stopped asking to bring friends over during my weekends. They spent more time in their rooms. When I tried to plan anything, a movie, going out to eat, even just a walk, they reacted like I was asking too much. One weekend, I suggested we all go to a park, something simple. My youngest got excited immediately, running to find their shoes. The older two exchanged a look. "We already went with Dad," my middle child said. It wasn't the words, it was the way they said it, like that meant the experience didn't need to happen again here. I said we could still go, that it didn't matter if they'd been before. My oldest shrugged. "We'll stay here." I remember standing there with my youngest halfway out the door, shoes on the wrong feet, waiting. In the end, I took just my youngest. They had fun in the way little kids do, running around, pointing at things, asking questions. But every so often, they'd look around like they were expecting someone else to be there. On the way back, they asked, "Why didn't they come?" I said they were tired. My youngest nodded, then asked, "Would they come if Dad was there?" I didn't answer right away. They noticed. That silence felt louder than anything I could have said. At home, the older kids were exactly where we left them. Same positions, same screens, like nothing had happened. I tried to talk to them that evening, not about the park specifically, but about spending time together, about making an effort as a family. My oldest listened, then said, "We didn't choose this." It wasn't said with anger. It was just stated. I asked what they meant. They looked at me for a second, then away. "This," they said, gesturing vaguely around the room. I knew what they meant. That was one of the few times they let something like that slip out directly. Most of the time, their feelings came through in smaller ways. Avoidance, short answers, choosing their dad's house whenever there was flexibility. There were also moments where it showed up in how they treated my youngest. Not outright cruelty, but distance that felt deliberate. My youngest would bring them toys, asking to play. They'd say, "Maybe later," and never follow through. They'd sit at the table together and talk about school, inside jokes forming that my youngest couldn't follow. Once, my youngest climbed onto the couch next to my middle child and leant against them. My middle child shifted away, not sharply, just enough to create space. My youngest noticed. Of course they did. They went quiet for the rest of the evening. I tried to address it again, telling the older kids they needed to include their sibling more, that it wasn't fair to leave them out. That's when my oldest said that line that stuck with me. "You don't get to make this our job." I didn't have anything to say to that, not in the moment. Because underneath the frustration, I knew they were right in a way I didn't want to admit. Still, knowing that didn't make it easier to watch. As time went on, my youngest started reacting differently. Less trying, more withdrawing. They stopped bringing toys over as often, stopped asking as many questions. Instead, they'd sit nearby and watch or go off on their own. That shift scared me more than when they were trying. There was one night where everything came together in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It was a Sunday evening, the night before the older kids were going back to their dads. They were packing their bags in that casual, practiced way they had. Chargers, clothes, things they didn't want to forget. My youngest was sitting on the floor nearby, watching. They asked, "Can I come?" My oldest didn't even look up. No. My youngest waited a second, then asked, "Why?" My middle child answered this time. Because it's not your house. That one landed hard. I stepped in and told them that wasn't how we talked to each other, told them to be more considerate. My oldest finally looked up at me. You want us to lie? I said no, but they didn't need to say it like that. They shrugged and went back to packing. My youngest didn't say anything else. They just got up and went to their room. Later that night, I found them sitting on their bed, holding one of the older kids' old toys that had been left behind months ago. They asked me if they could keep it. I said yes, of course. They held on to it like it meant something bigger than just a toy. That night was when I messaged my ex again, more directly than before. I told him what had happened. I told him our kids were creating a divide that was only getting worse. I told him that even a small gesture from him could make a difference. His response was the same as always, but with an added line. He said he had asked the kids if they wanted more interaction with their sibling, and they had said no. He said he wasn't going to override that. I read that message over and over because that meant he wasn't just refusing himself. He was reinforcing their choice. After that, something in me shifted from asking to pushing. I started bringing it up more often. Not every day, but enough that it was clearly something I wasn't dropping. I suggested compromises, short visits, shared outings in neutral places. Even just being present at events where all the kids were already there. He turned all of it down. At some point, I crossed into anger more openly. I told him he was acting like a good person while ignoring a child who was right in front of him. I told him he was setting an example for our kids that would follow them into how they treated people later on. He didn't engage with that part at all. He kept his responses focused on the same point. His responsibility was to our shared children. That was also around the time my situation started falling apart financially. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling. Work became unstable. Hours changed. Then I lost the job completely. I tried to find something else quickly, but nothing lined up the way I needed it to. Rent started becoming harder to manage. Bills piled up in ways that didn't leave room for error. I cut back on everything I could. Groceries got simpler. Outings stopped entirely. I told the kids we were staying in more, trying to make it sound like a choice. The older kids noticed immediately. They started bringing more things from their dad's house, food mostly. Snacks, leftovers, things they didn't want to go without. They didn't say anything about it, but it was obvious. My youngest noticed too. One afternoon, they asked why the older kids always had better food. I said it wasn't better, just different. They didn't look convinced. That's when I started reaching out to my ex about practical things as well. Not for myself, but for the kids. Or at least, that's how I framed it. Sometimes I asked if he could send extra food when they came over. Sometimes I asked if he could help cover something specific. And sometimes, mixed into those messages, I would bring up my youngest again. He responded to the parts about our kids. He ignored or refused anything related to my youngest. At one point, he included a list of local resources I could contact for assistance. I stared at that message for a long time. It felt like being redirected instead of helped, even though I knew, logically, that he wasn't obligated to do anything more. But logic doesn't help much when you're trying to stretch groceries across a week and explain to a child why something they saw last month isn't happening again. Eventually, things got bad enough that custody was brought back into court. I knew I was in trouble before anyone said it out loud. It was in the questions I was asked, how steady my income was, what my living situation looked like long term, how I planned to manage school routines, healthcare, and basic consistency. I had answers, but they sounded thinner every time I heard them. My ex didn't need to say much. His life, at least from the outside, looked stable. Same job, same house, same routines. The kids had their own spaces there. Their schedules made sense there. I hated how obvious the comparison felt. When the decision came through and he was given primary custody, I felt like something inside me dropped out completely. I still had time with them every other weekend, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't even close. The first weekend after that change felt different in a way I wasn't prepared for. Before, when they came to me, it was part of a shared rhythm. Now it felt like they were visiting. They brought more things with them than usual, not just clothes, chargers, books, specific snacks, things they didn't want to be without. They moved through the space like they were adjusting instead of settling in. My youngest was excited at first. They always were at the start of those weekends. They waited by the door before the older kids arrived, asking what time it was and asking if they were close. When the older kids walked in, my youngest lit up, immediately talking, showing them something they had been saving. A drawing, I think. Something they'd worked on all week. My oldest gave it a quick look and said, "That's cool," in a tone that ended the conversation right there. My youngest didn't seem to notice at first. They kept talking, following them into the house. My middle child went straight to their bag, pulling things out, already half-focused somewhere else. I stood there watching it unfold, feeling like I was watching two different worlds overlap without actually connecting. That weekend set the tone for the ones that followed. The older kids settled into a pattern quickly. They'd arrive, spend most of their time in their own spaces, and leave again. They weren't disruptive. They weren't openly rude. They were just elsewhere, even when they were physically there. And my youngest kept trying to bridge something that wasn't meeting them halfway. At first, I tried to manage it more actively. I set up activities, board games, baking, things that required everyone to be in the same place. Sometimes it worked for short stretches. More often, it felt forced. The older kids would participate just enough to get through it, then drift away again. One weekend, I suggested we all cook dinner together. Something simple. My youngest got excited immediately, dragging a chair over to the counter to help. My oldest sighed, not loudly, but enough that I heard it. Do we have to? I said yes, that it would be good to do something together. They went along with it, but the whole thing felt off. My youngest tried to hand them things, talk to them, and be included. The older kids responded in short bursts like they were checking boxes. At one point, my youngest spilled something. Not a big mess, just enough to require cleaning up. My middle child stepped back immediately. Watch it. It wasn't harsh, but it wasn't gentle either. My youngest froze for a second, then started apologizing over and over. I stepped in and told them it was fine, accidents happen. But the mood had already shifted. The rest of the evening carried that tension quietly. Later that night, after the older kids had gone to their rooms, my youngest asked me, "Do they not like me?" It wasn't the first time they'd asked something like that, but there was something different in how they said it. Less confusion, more expectation. I told them it wasn't that simple, that their siblings were still adjusting, that things would get better with time. Even as I said it, I didn't fully believe it anymore. Around this time, my youngest started asking more direct questions about their father. Not the biological one, the one who had already faded out of their life, but my ex. Why doesn't he come here? Why doesn't he talk to me? Did I do something? That last question came up more than once. I tried to answer in ways that didn't place blame where it didn't belong, but there's only so much you can soften something before it stops making sense. I said he wasn't their dad. I said he took care of the older kids. I said families can look different. None of it satisfied them. They started connecting dots on their own. One night, after the older kids had left to go back to their dads, my youngest stood by the door longer than usual. They watched the car pull away, then asked, "Why did they get to go and I don't?" I said it was because that was their home too. They looked at me and said, "This is my home." There wasn't anything I could say to that. That was around the same time their birthday happened. I tried to make it feel special, even with everything being tight financially. I planned ahead, saved what I could, and kept it simple but thoughtful. The older kids were there because it was my weekend. My youngest had been talking about their birthday for days leading up to it. Not in a demanding way, just excited. Counting down, asking what we were going to do, asking if their siblings would be there all day. The morning started fine. They opened the few presents I could manage. They smiled, thanked me, and hugged me. But there was a pause after each gift, a quick glance towards their siblings like they were waiting for something else. Nothing came. The older kid said, "Happy birthday." That was it. I hadn't asked them to get anything. I didn't want to force it. I thought maybe they would on their own. That was my mistake. When we brought out the cake, my youngest asked, "Did Dad send anything?" The room went still. My oldest answered before I could, "He's not your dad." My youngest's face changed immediately. The excitement from earlier just dropped. I told my oldest that wasn't how we talked to each other. Told them to apologize. They shook their heads. I'm not going to pretend. I sent them to the other room, more out of instinct than anything else. My youngest didn't cry right away. They just sat there staring at the cake. Then, quietly, they asked if they could blow out the candles. I said yes. They made a wish. I don't know what it was, but I have a feeling I could guess. That night, after everything had settled, I messaged my ex again. Not carefully this time. I told him what had happened. I told him our kids were learning to exclude someone right in front of them. I told him he could do something small and chose not to. I said he acted like a good person but treated my youngest like they didn't exist. His response came later. He didn't address most of what I said. He focused on one point. He said he was not responsible for my youngest and that I needed to stop framing it like he was. He added that if I were struggling to provide for them, there were services available and I should use them. Reading that, after the day I had just had, pushed something in me further than before. After that, my messages became more frequent, less measured. I started pointing out specific situations, moments where my youngest was affected. I told him his refusal wasn't neutral, it had an impact. He stayed consistent, short replies. No engagement with anything beyond the legal reality. At one point, I told him I would let him adopt my youngest. I didn't plan to say it, it came out in the middle of everything else. I said if he cared about stability, if he cared about the kids having a consistent environment, then this was a solution. He responded that he wasn't interested and that I shouldn't bring it up again. That was it. After that, something shifted again, but this time it wasn't just between me and him. It was in how my youngest started seeing things. They stopped asking if they could go with their siblings. They stopped asking if my ex would ever come around. Instead, they started asking different questions. Why don't they want me there? Why don't they talk to me? Am I part of the family? That last one is the one that stays with me, because I don't know how to answer it in a way that feels true from their perspective. I tell them yes, of course I do, but I also see what they see, the separation, the difference in how they're treated, the absence where something should be. And now, more recently, the messages between me and my ex have got worse. I've said things I probably shouldn't have. I've accused him of being cold, of setting a bad example, of ignoring a child who didn't choose any of this. He's kept everything saved. I know that. He doesn't say it, but I know. Part of me doesn't even care anymore if it ends up back in court. Another part knows I can't afford that, in more ways than one. But every time my youngest asks another question I can't answer cleanly, I feel that frustration build again. Because at the end of all of this, there's a child who only has me. And I'm trying to be enough while also knowing exactly why that might not feel like enough to them. So now I'm here, asking this. Am I wrong for expecting my ex to show even a small amount of care towards my youngest? Or am I pushing something that was never going to happen no matter what I say or do? You're asking him to parent the living proof of the affair that ended his marriage. Your youngest is innocent, completely. But your ex is also allowed to protect himself from being pulled into that pain forever. A birthday card sounds small to you because you're seeing your child's face. To him, it's probably the first brick in a bridge he never agreed to build. The harder truth is your older kids aren't being cruel. They're refusing to clean up an adult mess. They lost their original family, watched you have another child, then got asked to emotionally absorb that child so everyone could feel less awful. Your youngest needs support. Therapy, school counselor, support groups, maybe child support enforcement against bio dad if possible. But your ex is not the replacement part. You created a wound, and now you're angry. He won't bleed in a way that benefits you. I actually feel awful for every child here. Your youngest is standing there with their nose pressed against the glass, watching 3 siblings have a dad, and that is heartbreaking as hell. But your 3 older kids are also kids. They are not bonus parents. They are not emotional service siblings. They don't owe closeness because you want the house to feel less broken. You keep saying small gesture, but kids don't experience that stuff as small. If your ex sends one gift, your youngest will hope for another. If he takes them once, they'll ask why not again. Then your older kids will feel like even their dad got folded into the affair aftermath. That's not healing. That's spreading the damage around. The bio dad is the biggest coward in this story, honestly. Go after him, legally, financially, whatever way is available. Stop knocking on the door of the man who already told you no. You're still minimizing what you did even now. You didn't just make a mistake. You had an affair, got pregnant, blew up your marriage, and permanently altered your kids' lives. That's not a rough patch. That's a chain reaction that's still hitting everyone years later. Your older kids aren't confused. They know exactly what happened, and they've drawn their own line. They want distance from anything tied to it. That includes your youngest. It's harsh, but it's real. And your ex refusing to play dad to that child. Completely understandable. You're basically asking him to emotionally adopt the reminder of the worst betrayal of his life. A card, a gift, an outing. Those aren't neutral acts. Those are openings to a role he has already said no to, repeatedly. Meanwhile, the actual father of that child walked away, and somehow you're not directing this level of anger at him. That's the part that stands out. You're trying to shift responsibility onto the one person who's still stable because it's easier than dealing with the one who disappeared and the reality of your own choices. Your youngest deserves support, consistency, and honesty. But what they don't deserve is being used as a reason to pressure someone who has every right to stay out of it. I read through a lot of what people said. I'm not going to pretend it all sat well with me. Some of it felt unfair. Some of it felt like people were reducing me to one decision I made years ago. I know what I did. I live with it every day. I'm not just that mistake, and I'm not the only adult in this situation making choices that affect a child. But I also can't ignore what's happening right in front of me anymore, because things have got worse in ways I didn't expect. The biggest shift has been with my youngest. Before, they were trying, constantly, following their siblings around, asking questions, trying to be included in anything. That was hard to watch, but at least there was still some kind of hope in it. That's changed. Now it's like something in them flipped. Instead of trying to be included, they've started saying they don't care. I don't even want to go with them. I don't like their dad anyway. The first time they said that, it caught me off guard. It sounded rehearsed, like they were repeating something they thought they were supposed to feel. I didn't correct it. I didn't reinforce it either, but I didn't push back the way I probably should have. In that moment, it felt like relief. Like maybe they were protecting themselves and it would hurt less. That didn't last, because it didn't stay contained. A couple weekends ago, all 4 kids were at my place. The older ones were talking about something they were doing the next day with their dad, some outing they had planned. They weren't trying to exclude anyone, they were just talking like they normally do. My youngest cut in and said, "I wouldn't go even if he asked me." The room went quiet. My oldest looked at them and said, "He wouldn't ask you." My youngest immediately got defensive. Started saying they didn't care, that they didn't want to go anyway, that their dad, meaning the biological one, would do better things. That's when my middle child snapped a little and said, "You don't even have one." I stepped in at that point, but the damage was already done. My youngest went to their room and didn't come out for a long time. Later that night, when I checked on them, they didn't cry. That's the part that scared me. They just asked if they could sleep in my bed. They haven't asked that in a long time. Another thing that's been happening is they've started picking at things that connect to their siblings. Not in an obvious way. Small things. One of the older kids had left a hoodie at my place a while ago. My youngest used to wear it sometimes because it made them feel closer to them. Last weekend, I found it stuffed at the back of the closet, inside out. I asked about it. They shrugged and said they didn't want it anymore. Then there was a drawing they had made of all 4 of them. They used to keep it on their wall. I found it in the trash, ripped in half. When I asked why, they said it wasn't right. I didn't know what to say to that. Things with the older kids have also got worse, but in a different way. They're not just distant anymore. They're more direct. There was one moment that I can't stop thinking about. I had tried to plan something simple again. Just dinner together, no pressure, nothing elaborate. I thought maybe keeping it low-key would make it easier. During dinner, I asked if we could take a picture together. Just one. I said it would be nice to have something with all of us. My oldest immediately said no. I asked why. Not aggressively, just trying to understand. They said, "Because this isn't what you think it is." I asked what that meant. They looked at me for a second and said, "This isn't a family like you keep trying to make it." That hit harder than I expected. I told them we are a family, that we're all connected whether they like it or not. They didn't argue, they just didn't engage anymore. My youngest heard all of that. They didn't react right away, but later that night they asked me, "Are we actually a family or just pretending?" I said we are a family. They asked, "Then why do they act like we're not?" There's no clean answer to that. I've also made mistakes recently. I can admit that, even if people will probably say I'm still not taking enough responsibility. There was a moment where I pushed something I shouldn't have. The older kids had brought things from their dad's house again, snacks, clothes, small stuff. My youngest noticed, like always. I told the older kids they needed to be more mindful about that. That bringing certain things and talking about certain plans made things harder for their sibling. My middle child said, "So we're supposed to act like our life doesn't exist?" I said no, but they could be more considerate. My oldest said, "Or we could just not come." That was the first time they said something like that directly. I told them they didn't have a choice right now. They shrugged and said, "We will soon." That stuck with me. I also reached out to my ex again after another incident. I know people will say I should stop, but I can't just sit there while this gets worse. I told him what was happening with our kids, that the divide isn't just there, it's getting deeper. I told him our youngest is starting to internalize things in ways that aren't healthy. I asked again if he could do something small, even just acknowledging them in some way. He said no, same as always. I pushed harder this time. I told him he's choosing to let a child feel rejected when he could ease that even slightly. He responded that I need to stop contacting him about anything unrelated to our children and that if I continue, he will handle it legally. There's something else that happened that I haven't told anyone yet. My youngest overheard more than they should have. I don't know exactly how much, but I know enough. The older kids were in the living room talking. They didn't realize my youngest was nearby. I was in the kitchen, so I heard parts of it. My middle child said something like, "It's not our fault she did that." And my oldest said, "Yeah, but we have to deal with it anyway." My youngest walked in right after that and asked, "Did you do something?" Everything went quiet. My oldest tried to brush it off, but my youngest kept asking, not aggressively, just confused. Later that night, they asked me directly, "Did you do something bad?" I tried to explain it in a way that didn't put everything on them but also didn't lie completely. I said I made a mistake that hurt people. They asked, "Is that why I don't have a dad?" I didn't answer right away. They took that as an answer. Since then, they've been different with me too. Not distant exactly, but more aware. Like they're connecting things in a way they weren't before. A couple nights ago, they said something that I haven't been able to shake. "You're the reason everything is weird." They didn't say it with anger, just like they were stating something they figured out. I told them it's more complicated than that. They said, "It doesn't feel complicated." I didn't know what to say. And despite all of this, I still don't think I'm wrong for wanting my youngest to have more than this. I understand my ex's position, I really do, but understanding it doesn't make it feel any less cruel from where I'm standing. Because at the end of the day, I'm watching a child try to figure out why they're the only one left out, and I'm supposed to just accept that this is how it stays. I don't really know why I'm writing this again. Maybe because there's no one left to say it to. Things are different now. Not better in the way people like to imagine when they say, "It gets better." Just different, quieter in a way that doesn't feel like peace. I did change things after my last post, not because of what people said exactly, but because I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. I got a more stable job. Not great, but steady. Same hours, predictable income. I moved into a smaller place that I could actually afford without constantly juggling bills. I tried to create something consistent. Meals at the same time, school routines, and less chaos. I cut out anything that made things unstable. No more last-minute decisions, no more trying to fix everything in big emotional swings. For a while, I thought maybe that would help. It didn't. Not in the way I hoped. My older kids stopped coming altogether before anything else could really settle. It didn't happen overnight, but it was obvious where it was heading. First, they asked to shorten visits. Then they started finding reasons not to come. Eventually, it went back to court, and their dad pushed for reduced or supervised contact. He didn't have to try that hard. They spoke for themselves. Hearing your own children explain why they don't want to be around you is something I don't think I'll ever get used to. There wasn't yelling or anything dramatic, just calm, clear answers. They said they felt uncomfortable, that things felt tense, that they didn't feel like they belonged there. One of them said, "It doesn't feel like home." That was enough. Now I'd barely see them. Occasionally, in controlled settings. Short, careful conversations that feel more like obligations than anything else. They don't ask about me anymore when they're not there. I know that because I stopped hearing anything back through anyone else. And my ex, he doesn't engage beyond what's required. Everything is formal now, structured, no room for anything personal. I used to be angry about that. I still am sometimes. But mostly it just feels final. What I didn't expect was what happened with my youngest. For a while, it was just us. I thought maybe, finally, it would be easier without the constant comparison. No siblings coming in and out, no reminders every other weekend of what they didn't have. I thought I could rebuild something with just the two of us. And for a short time, it almost felt like that. They were calmer, less reactive. They stopped asking about their siblings as much. Stopped asking about my ex entirely. At first, I thought that meant they were adjusting. It wasn't that. It was something else. They stopped asking because they stopped expecting. That difference didn't hit me right away. It showed up in small ways. They didn't talk about school much. Didn't bring things home to show me the way they used to. Didn't ask for help with things unless they absolutely had to. They were there, physically, but something about how they moved through the house felt separate. I tried to engage more. Asked questions, suggested things, tried to spend time together. They went along with it, but it felt like I was the only one pushing. There was a moment that I think marked the shift clearly. I had picked them up from school. They got into the car, sat down, and just stared out the window. I asked how their day was. Fine. I asked if anything happened. No. I let it go for a bit, then tried again later at home. Same answers. Finally, I asked if something was wrong. They said, "No, I just don't feel like talking." That was new, not defiance, not attitude, just absence. Then it got worse. One night, completely out of nowhere, they said, "I think I'd rather live somewhere else." I asked what they meant. They shrugged. "Just somewhere else." I asked if they meant with their siblings. They said no. That confused me more than anything. I asked where, then. They said, "I don't know, just not here." That's when I realized it wasn't about comparison anymore. It wasn't about wanting what the others had. It was about not wanting what they had with me. Things escalated after that in ways I didn't fully understand until it was already happening. School got involved again. Not because of something dramatic, but because of changes they noticed. Withdrawal, lack of engagement, things slipping academically. They recommended counseling. I agreed. I thought that would help. Instead, it brought more things out. Things they hadn't said to me, they said there. That they felt different. That they didn't feel connected to anyone. That they felt like they weren't supposed to be where they were. And then the part that came back to me later, through conversations I wasn't even fully part of, that they blamed me. Not in a loud, angry way. Just as a fact, that everything felt the way it did because of me. I tried to address it with them, gently, carefully. I told them I know things are complicated, that I made mistakes, but I was trying to do better. They looked at me and said, "It doesn't change anything." That sentence, it stayed. Because they're right, in a way. Trying now doesn't undo what already shaped everything. Things moved quickly after that. There were more evaluations, more recommendations, conversations about what would be best for their well-being. I pushed back at first. Of course I did. They're my child. But it didn't go the way I thought it would. Eventually, the decision was made that they would be placed elsewhere. Not with my ex, not with the siblings, somewhere neutral. Temporary, they said. It didn't feel temporary. The day they left, they didn't cry. They packed their things quietly, took what they wanted, left behind what they didn't. I kept waiting for some kind of reaction. There was some sign that this mattered to them the way it did to me. It didn't come. At the door, I said I loved them. They nodded, just nodded. And then they left. The house has been empty ever since. Not physically empty. There's still furniture, still things. But it feels like everything that made it a home is gone. I sit here sometimes and think about how it all unfolded. Not just the big moments, but the smaller ones. The ones I brushed off or justified or thought I could fix later. I regret a lot. I regret thinking I could balance everything without it tipping over. I regret pushing when I should have stepped back. I regret not understanding sooner what this was doing to all of them. But I also can't ignore the anger that's still there. I'm mad at my ex for shutting everything down so completely. At the biological father for disappearing and leaving all of this behind. At the situation itself for unfolding the way it did. At everything, really. Even at things that don't make sense to be angry at. Sometimes I find myself thinking about how different things could have been if just one person had acted differently, if one decision had gone another way. And then I circle back to the same place, because I know where it started. I just don't think I understood how far it would go. Now there's nothing left to fix, just space where everything used to be. This is what it looks like when someone keeps trying to solve an emotional problem with structural fixes. New house, stable job routines, counseling, fewer conflicts. On paper, that's growth. That's what people say you're supposed to do. And she did it. But none of it touched the core issue, because the core issue wasn't instability. It was meaning. Her youngest didn't just lose a father figure. They grew up inside a story where their existence meant something uncomfortable to everyone around them. Kids are extremely good at picking up emotional subtext long before they understand facts. By the time explanations came, the emotional conclusion was already formed. I am the reason things feel wrong. That's not something you fix with routine. And here's the part people miss. The older kids weren't just rejecting their sibling. They were protecting a version of reality that made sense to them. If they accepted the youngest fully, it would require them to emotionally reorganize what happened to their family. That's a big ask for adults, let alone kids. So instead, they drew a line and held it. The mother kept trying to erase that line, not maliciously, not even consciously. But let's take a picture. Every be more inclusive and every push for shared moments was an attempt to force a version of reality that didn't match what the others were actually experiencing. And kids can feel that disconnect instantly. That's why the youngest eventually stopped asking and started withdrawing. Not because they gave up on connection, but because they realized connection in that environment came with conditions they couldn't meet. There's also something else here that's uncomfortable but important. Remorse isn't the same as accountability when it comes to relationships. She feels regret, Deeply, that's clear. But a lot of her actions, even later, are still centered around making the outcome less painful rather than accepting it as it is. There's a difference between, I wish this didn't hurt so much, and I accept that this is what it is now. The people around her adjusted to reality. She kept trying to renegotiate it. That gap is where everything collapsed. And the ending. It's not dramatic. No big confrontation, no explosive fallout, just quiet separation. That's what makes it more real. Because sometimes the consequence isn't chaos, it's absence. No one screaming, no one fighting, just people stepping back one by one until there's nothing left to reach for. If there's anything to take from this, it's this. You can't rebuild relationships by designing the outcome you want, especially not when the people involved experience the same event in completely different emotional realities. And if you keep trying to correct the picture instead of sitting inside the truth of it, eventually the people in that picture stop showing up altogether.